I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come here today and to talk about the impact of environmental concerns on my sculpture. Since the work I'm going to be showing you today spans 40 years, and since the context in which I create work is greatly affected by the specific site, situation, there'll be a wide, diverse group of pieces that you will see, and I want to encourage you to stop me and ask any questions you might have along the way, because I'm always tempted to show too many things at once. The presentation will be divided into roughly 3 sections, and the first one will be focused on the development of my sculpture, and the middle one will be a brief presentation about educational efforts that I've made to confront the sustainability of my practice. And the last section will be focused on public art projects that celebrate the environment more than be a critique of the environmental impact. So I started college with the assumption that I would become a medical doctor, but my path led to surgery on clay instead of flesh. Both these pieces were made during cultural exchange residencies in the Soviet Union, and at the height of anxiety about possible nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Nuclear thinker on the left is grappling with containment issues for his atomic brain explosion. And the open heart surgery in the Latvian shield on the right represents the fragile balance between hope and dread in Latvia just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This piece is based on the shape and iconography of Latvian town shields, and I was in residence at Riga just at the time of that collapse. And both of those are clay murals. Oops, I'm going to do this. Clay is a very good medium for dealing with visceral substance, concrete physical objects, but I also feel the need to create elusive, ephemeral environments to express my response to unsettling and unstable situations. The same concern for possible nuclear war was an impetus for this installation, Nuclear Home, created with transparent and reflective materials, screen, plexiglass, mirror. It's difficult to capture the kinesthetic quality of this installation in images. The room was wrenched apart by altering basic visual architectural cues. And wishing well was not enough to keep things under control. Altered architectural cues force the viewer to investigate the space with tentative steps, reaching out to see if a plane is solid or empty. The forced perspective in this piece caused students to argue about whether the floor was level or sloped and actually bring in a level to try to prove it was sloped when it wasn't. Gradually, my elusive gallery environments became more contained. Consolidating around the clock in this piece, hours appear as flickering flames that seem to burn in thin air because of the use of mirror and scratching through the back of the mirror, and have flickering flame bulbs behind where they were not visible except where the mirror had been scratched. Generally, I'm not talking too much about technique here, but if you have any technique questions, stop me. In Panacea, the melting elixir of the Americas drips into a bowl as the continents endure intense scrutiny. In On Thin Ice, the warm hearth is surrounded by melting consequences, images of the hunt. I was hunting in melting snowbanks with my camera to find animal forms endangered by the rising temperatures. Some sort of a bird and a great cat skull. And this dinosaur was conveniently located right in front of a T-Rex sign. And this polar bear is splayed out on its back. In biopsy, visceral substance is revealed below the surface. Viewed from the backlit side, the same piece seems to have no substance. This piece was an experiment to see if I could rely on penetrating cylinders to structurally support two fragile skins. Using this material of perforated metal, of which there is some right above us, is a discovery process for me as well as the viewer. I've used this material since the mid-'80s, and I'm still surprised to discover new moire patterns from the layering and shaping of the material. This is the first time, this piece is the first time I ever saw those bullseye patterns. The layering, as well as the viewer's shifting perspective, animate the sculpture with a constantly changing array of patterns. I should have brought in a little video, but just the slightest movement, these patterns are constantly shifting, and I'm only using a standard grid, for each of the pieces. It's very expensive to get custom size holes punched through material. So in the lower middle section is an example of the material that's being used. And it's this endless array of different patterns depending on slight changes of the orientation between the two layers. These pieces were made during the Gulf oil spill, and that context fueled my emotional engagement and provided a sounding board for formal decisions. Even though these pieces are quite abstract, I generally have something, so sort of a narrative in my mind that helps me make formal decisions. As a sculptor, there's nothing worse for me than a blank canvas, and nothing better than a big empty space. But there's also nothing worse than no specific space. I've always been interested in the overlapping connections and associations between a functional object and a specific site. Whether I start with a plate on a table or a wall in a plaza, I explore the convergence of actual, implied, and symbolic content to express social and environmental concerns. My map vessels merge the concept of function and site and address issues of resource consumption. Environmental, social, and art historical references are blended with the map's suggestive visual associations. During a semester of teaching in Korea, I lived in a valley where a highway was being built over the course of a stream, and I had to buy bottled water for the first time in my life. And partly because the shape of Korea is so suggestive of a vessel form, I wanted to create this vessel to emphasize the value of the river systems for drinking and fishing. And that line on the right is the dividing line between North and South Korea. It's a little hard to see, but there's a slight relief on these map vessels where the rivers have been incised into the surface of the clay. So that one side is so these are two different sides of the same vessel. And here's Vermont, Also thinking about water quality, pumping water from Vermont, Pennsylvania pouring, arid zona. And catch-all, Cape Cod, overfishing. Cape Cod is sort of an empty bowl. This is from Duxbury, down through Cape Cod and following a river to get this very anthropomorphic shape. This was made right at the beginning of the invasion of Iraq. Thinking about Iraq as a fertile crescent and always seeing that, immediately saw this sort of tank form in the shape of Iraq. So this is Iraq's fertile crescent, pouring oil, a natural resource inseparable from military intervention. In the United States is a melting pot overheated by overconsumption of oil. I had the opportunity to participate in an exhibition in Peru, and I've always been amazed and drawn to the creative ceramics of the moche culture in Peru. I created this stirrup vessel inspired by this moche vessel below. So the stirrup vessel features the moche iconography of a mythic jaguar fish that is, in the case of this, it's a little hard to see on the screen because of the sun coming in, but there's a mine excavated in the side of the fish. Since mining and fishing for Peru's abundant natural resources have major historic and contemporary impacts on the culture and environment. I had been working on a public piece, which I'll show you in a while, for a science building. And I used a lot of imagery, microscopic and telescopic imagery for that project. And after looking at all these microscope and telescope images for over a year, I decided to make my own system for examining evidence more intensely. And it's a little hard to see, but these are all detailed images of holes that are in that collection of wooden boxes on the left, and some of them penetrate all the way through down about 3 feet. Others are shallower, but each of them is a cylinder that's lined with mylar. And at the base of that cylinder is an object or an image. And it's those cylinders, they just amplify the presence by projecting that thing and sort of popping it up to the surface. It's a really amazing visual effect. You can sort of see, anyway, that there's a circular section at the base of that green and brown thing in the middle, and then all the rest that you see is a reflection of that. And I've embedded these scopes in a variety of structures. This table for 2 is set for the consumption of natural resources. This figurative constellation of core samples is crying and menstruating a landscape, and the sea level is rising. I was asked to be in an exhibition about color. It was a ceramics exhibition in Korea, and they wanted pieces to do with the future of color. So I made this inkwell, and at the bottom of it is a photograph of a copper mine with all these. And copper is a material that's used in ceramics a lot. for various colorants. So there's this copper mine, source of the color, dug into this landscape. And jumping back to metal installations, this sculpture was motivated by the impact of weather forecasts on our psyche and our own impact on the long-term forecast. It's at Boston Sculptors Gallery, where I have exhibitions every couple of years. This is the back of it, a couple of images. And that piece led to an interest to collaborate with the poet Roz Zimmerman. We had worked together on a piece and had such a good time that we continued and did a collaborative installation together. We both were very interested in the impact of weather on one's psyche. And we went to visit weather stations, and she did a lot of research and discovered this international set of meteorological symbols and incorporated them into her poetry. This piece is called Continued Disturbances, and this is a little bit of the text that's woven, into the sculpture. And this is a project that we did, a collaborative installation that we did last year that included this initial piece we had collaborated on with other pieces. This is sort of a weather station, an under the weather station, and this is a weather vane, sort of an IV, swirling around, and various other scopes and things to explore. And a close-up, it's hard to read, but her poetry is whirling around underneath this glass cover. And in that scope on the top, if you look in, you see all these different images that we had taken from the computer screens at our NOAA visit. And then we both had been collecting CDs and really wanting to figure out something to do with CDs. And we collected more and more and made an 8-foot tall ice core with her poetry interwoven in it. And she was friends with Mark Bowen, who is a writer and a physicist, and had just recently written a book called The Telescope and the Ice. And he had also written on thin ice in 2005, where he went all over the world with a team that was taking core samples of glaciers in the near the equator instead of on the poles. And this book was described by Bill McKibben as one of the best books yet published on climate change. And it's a really wonderful history as well as an exciting dramatic stories from trying to dig ice cores at 14,000 feet and lug them down and not have them melt when you get down to equator zones. But so he gave a talk during our presentation, during our exhibition, and which leads me to a short section talking about my thinking about the sustainability of my sculptural practice itself. Both during the 2019 exhibition and during a previous exhibition I had called Embodied Energy, we produced a forum on embodied energy and the environmental impact of various art materials and practices. from paint to metals to whatever. And purchased carbon credits to offset all the, oops, you're going on your own now, oops. And purchased carbon credits to offset all the energy that was used by me and embodied in the work. Can we have this thing not do its own thing? Anyway, embodied in the materials for this exhibition. I have given many lectures on ceramics and sustainability in China, Sweden, and the States because of my long experience with teaching and working in ceramics. Knowing how to evaluate, discuss, and improve the environmental impact of one's own art practice is a very critical art craft survival skill at the moment. And ceramics is a really interesting material to think about because of mining, transporting, firing, et cetera, glazing, and all the metal materials that are used for color. Mags Harries is a colleague of mine, a fellow Boston sculptor, and she also is a faculty person at the museum school, Tufts. And she is a very interesting sculptor who's done a lot of work involved in environmental issues. And a while ago, she made this table for an exhibition to provoke consciousness and action on resource conservation. And the table was a setting for people from different communities to come together, eat, and discuss common issues around global warming. 13 different household tables were cut and assembled to make a single 14-foot-long table. This table was originally exhibited at Boston Center for the Arts, and Mags, it's going to be exhibited again next month at Boston Sculptors Gallery. And when I first saw the table, I said, Mags, you need vessels for this fractured recycled table. And at the time, I was coordinating a collaborative project with the Sustainability Committee students at Harvard. And I had Mags come speak to the group, and then each student brainstormed about sustainability tables that they could make for each of the houses. And I used the leftover parts from Mags's table to exhibit this group of vessels that I made in response to her table and its resource conservation ethic. The series is called Mend Thy Wares, which calls to mind the biblical advice to mend thy ways. And it's all these leftover broken things I had around the house. And these global porcelain platters were also constructed from broken leftover pieces and paid homage to the global impact of Chinese porcelain as well as to mending thy ways. So lastly, I'm going to talk about some public art projects that I've done that celebrate the environment. The first big public opportunity I had was to create a mural for the Sonora Desert Pavilion of the North Carolina Zoo in Asheboro. And the client wanted something that would, that would present naturalistic animals in some way, and trying to figure out how to do that in an interesting way was the challenge. And the solution ended up being this 50-foot snake on the entrance wall to the pavilion. And within the snake, animals from the Sonora Desert are positioned according to when they're active in a day to night sequence. So you can see it goes from very light color into the darker night zone and back into day. And the reptile expert at zoo was not quite sure that having a 50-foot snake was realistic enough. You know what? But he finally said, well, maybe there could have been snakes that big. So here are a few details, and because, let's see, in the, and here's some things in process, but in the pavilion itself, there are such natural habitats for all of the animals that it's really hard to see them, let alone touch them. So this mural provided kids the opportunity to touch this pebbly Gila monster and Roadrunner. And that led to another public art project for a new visitor center at the Grand Canyon. And they wanted 30 low relief plants. They wanted local plants and animals in low relief embedded in the stucco of this big center. And instead of sticking, they wanted them to be camouflaged, you know, to feel as though they were camouflaged in the landscape instead of sticking out. So it was really difficult to make something lighter in the background and darker in the foreground. You know, it was sort of counterintuitive in terms of how you normally would do shading on something like that. But it did work to help camouflage it, and gradually figured it out. And all of these projects involved helpers, invaluable helpers. And I was working on this raven, and it had these little feathers, you know, near the nostrils. And I didn't know what they would do when the raven was flying. And my assistant, happened to have a crow in her freezer. So she took it out and thawed it and took it and held it out the window going down Route 2 at 60 miles an hour to see what would happen. So there was a lot of research involved. And and then also in the stone walls around this visitor center, there were little creatures hidden in the rock wall. And the park rangers provided young visitors with a checklist to see how many of the 30 plants and animals they could find and identify. And then outside on the plaza, they wanted I ended up creating the precise geology of a section of the South Rim to perfectly match the Park Service's photograph of the Lower Canyon at this orientation plaza where you could look and find, you know, what views you could see at different points. But they ended up printing this photograph in such high saturated colors that it didn't sink down the way the original photograph would have. And then I was asked to do a mural for Keene State College, a new science building. And let's see whether, oops. It's based on the actual shape of the local Ashuelot River, which has tributary streams and oxbows that are very suggestive of life forms and physical processes studied at the school. So there was a flat. Let's see how that's the. Yeah, this is better. So there was this sort of. There were two parts to the mural. One part were actual images of telescopic, microscopic images, research images that were collaged together in Photoshop and then used to create photo silk screens that printed the images on flat tiles that were glazed and shiny. And then surrounding that was the riverbank that had sort of suggestive textures and mysterious forms, an impression of actual and imaginary tools. to invite the viewer to sort of question, examine, and try to figure out what was going on in this more unknown territory compared to the actual photographic images next to them. And I consulted with the science faculty in order to select the imagery important to their area of concentration. There's a solar corona image that's collaged with a physicist's digital representation of electron flow patterns. And the actual river and this river mural were sites for environmental studies. And, this is, a lot of children came through this public corridor in that building. Yeah?
I'm just so fascinated. How did the project start in the first place? Did they say, we want the river, and then you took it from there?
No.
Or they give you the wall, and you took it from there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There was a competition, and there were requests for proposals, which is really hard, you know. I mean, ideally, there were requests for interest, and you send images of past work. But, you know, being in a competition where there's a request for a proposal, making a proposal is like this huge part of the whole that's the most difficult part. But I knew that the budget wasn't enough to cover this whole wall. It's 60 feet long and about 6 feet high. So I knew that I needed some meaningful shape that would carry, you know, be the mural. And you know, because of making those map vessels, I look at river shapes a lot. So I forget exactly how, it took a while, but I finally figured out, you know, I would use that local river as the shape. But exactly how to do it took a while to figure out. And it was, you know, ad-libbing all the way through. But, you know, one thing, because it was so complex, it would be really horrible to have grout lines showing all the time. You know, these are thick, heavy pieces of clay on the bank, several inches thick. And so another part of it was going back and camouflaging all the grout lines with with stains of various types. And also I've had the opportunity to do public art projects in metal, because another opportunity another criteria for public art is to create, to have materials that don't need a lot of maintenance and will last forever. So stainless steel is the material of choice for that. And in my gallery pieces, I use aluminum, and I can bend and cut these thin gauges of aluminum by myself, and you know, with someone. But wiring them together, all those pieces in the gallery that you saw together were wired together because they were too big to come in and out of the door. So I'd have to assemble them in the gallery and then take them apart. But they were all manageable, you know, for bending. But for outside, I need a heavier gauge, and I need stainless steel, and then I have to work with a welder, a fabricator, because I don't weld. And because it's perforate, even if I did weld, I wouldn't weld enough to be good enough to do it, because all those tiny little holes, you have to be so quick and so good and just do it all the time. Otherwise, you burn away some of the material. So this was created for Bristol Community College. They wanted an employee recognition garden. Some landscape person had plopped down these pedestals and wanted some sculptor to do something on them. And since it was a garden, And it was supposed to celebrate employees who'd worked 25 years, 30 years, 35 years, 40 years. So on each of these separate planters, there are these little plaques along the top of the rim with their names. So they honor the employees as planters nourishing growth, and plant forms in different stages of growth. It starts with a sprout, bud, flower, foliage, fruit, seed. You can't see the sprout down at the end. And I was interested in some of those forms and using them again, and ended up making this thing that looks like a probing insect in a prostate flower. So it's called Pollinate, and it is an exhibit. And the city of Cambridge wanted a wall for, this is near Tufts. This is on the corner of Mass Avenue and near Cameron. There was not a, this got simplified by budget constraints, but it ends up animating the streetscape and sheltering a plaza. And it's called Wave Wall, and Alewife is just down the street, that river. And then I had created there's a woman that invented a molecule that gives off light and is used for medical diagnosis, Irena Bronstein. Stop. And so this is a piece that celebrates her research and incorporates the diagram of the molecule that she developed. And my most recent public piece that was just installed in late August after a 7-year process is for the City of Lowell's Hamilton Canal District. And this is what the top is of what the idealized landscape when there's a development in the parking lot that's still empty, vision, but really it's sort of a weed-filled dog poop drug park. But there's a big new courthouse being built across the street, so that may help. But it's a wonderful site. It's at the intersection of two canals, and it celebrates the hydro energy that powered the mills at this site. And the city wanted something that would be tall enough to be visible from a road that just crosses to the right of that top picture, and also something that would be interactive and for kids because there's no playground in the area. So So the front part of it is solid, and it's sort of a turbine. It was inspired by this turbine form that I saw. And then the rest is perforated metal, transparent material that hopefully captures the sensation of swirling and flowing through a turbine. And kids do seem to like it and enjoy exploring this flowing, swirling forms. There they are all crawling through, and a friend and her son and dog curled up inside of one section. So it's there. This park, they are planning to redo the landscaping at some point soon, adding some topsoil and covering up the anchor plates, which I covered up with Photoshop, but they're all exposed now. Oh, this is upside down. I guess I can't fix that. Oh well. So I had mentioned in the little blurb about this presentation that I would talk about plans for College Ave, because I was selected as, there's an integrated art program for the college Green Line extension. There's 7 stations, and each station, an artist was chosen to create an integrated art project for each station. And this started about 5 years ago. And originally I was chosen for the College Avenue station, I believe, because the architect had seen the perforated metal fencing type thing, and he wanted something to camouflage this viaduct that was originally going to be at the corner. If you can look at this thing on the top and turn it counterclockwise in your brain, that's the viaduct up there. And then there's just this little generic transparent thing in front of it. So that was my assignment. And at that time, there was going to be a big plaza all the way across, the road, all the way across the tracks, leading from one side of the campus to the other, and maybe a building that was also going to cross the tracks there and create an even bigger plaza. And then everything, the whole Green Line extension project had big budget overruns, and it was stopped. And then everything was value engineered, and stations became platforms, and the whole package went out to bid again. And whomever bid on it could include the integrated art project if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. But there was a consortium of engineers and architects and construction companies that got together to bid on this project. They did keep the integrated art project, but it's now at 20% of the funding that had been in the earlier project. So I can tell you that much, but I can't tell you what I'm working on now for the new one, because I got a phone call yesterday saying, I saw a tweet that you were going to be talking about the Green Line project, and this is not public yet. I knew from all the plans, architectural plans that I had gotten, that I could not show any of those, that those weren't for public consumption because they were still in the design process and they weren't public. But I thought I could talk about my concept, which is sort of in this halfway development phase, but they said, no, you really can't. We have to wait on that. So I'm just going to talk about what I had, the initial phase of planning that I had gone through for the earlier possibility of camouflaging this viaduct. That's, in the current situation, that's no longer an issue. There's no big plaza going all the way across the tracks. But by telling you about this little process, it's indicative of other ways I've approached projects. If I'm going to make a generic fence, it's going to have to be pretty simple. It's long. It can't be too complicated. I have to have a pattern that has some meaning to me. And I had just gone to some lecture about bees and learned about waggle dances, and started thinking of, and the diagram for the waggle, this angle between the sun and the honey, the nectar, changes depending on where the honey is. But this 45-degree angle is pretty accurate. If you look at Tufts up there, on the top of this waggle dance, and the sun in the south, and that angle heading towards Boston, where the Green Line will take you, to all sorts of honey places, all sorts of, whether it's lucrative for going to work, or pleasurable for whatever else, or delicious for eating, you could be heading into Boston for honey. And so I was thinking about this waggle dance as a way of making decisions about how this fence might look. So it was these are some early 3D models. This never got past a very rudimentary conception phase before the whole project was ended. But there was black and white and yellow, and this thing, along the bottom, it sort of evolved and changed as it went all the way across that rail bed. And there's Curtis Hall in the background over there. And now station houses are now stairways leading down to platforms. So this is not the way things will be. And that's it. So any questions?
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was really impressive. Do we have questions?
To mount your sculptures, seems like you might need an engineer. Do you do that, or is there some people who help you with that?
Well, for the piece in Cambridge and for for the murals, I mount them all myself. I do all the mortaring and placing and with a team. You know, someone's mixing, someone's slopping it on, someone's back buttering the tiles, someone else is putting this, but I've done a ton of mortaring. So for the ceramic part, I do it all myself. For the stainless steel pieces that are large, such as the most recent one, Hydro, I hired an engineer both to determine, you know, the gauge metal and to determine the size of the footings and this, you know, the gauge of the anchor plates and all that. And then I offered to do the surveying. I have a transit, and I felt comfortable doing the surveying, but they said, no, you should get a professional surveyor. So, but, you know, they survey the site, and then I go and check to make sure that things are as they should be, because then I have to take that information to the fabricator, which in this case was in Providence, and lay out all those points on the floor so all the parts land in the right spot.
In museums.
Pardon?
In the museums.
In the galleries? Oh, I do all that installation myself. Yeah, on ladders and whatever. Yeah?
Hi. So I noticed you use a wide range of materials in your work, and I was wondering if you find yourself experimenting with different stuff for inspiration, or if you find yourself getting inspired by like a material and then finding a way to incorporate that into your work.
Yeah, I think primarily, well, I also have trouble figuring out how to show the work because the ceramics is so different from the perforated metal, or the reflective, yeah, it's not just perforated metal, they're reflective and transparent materials. I feel that I'm pretty much that I'm really, I don't experiment too much because I have used those materials for so long, and there's still, you know, surprises that I can find from the transparent reflective materials. But I think that they just come from two different ways of wanting to express myself, and the clay is really good for one way, and the translucent materials are much better for other ways of expressing myself. And so it's just, I feel that they're just two alternatives, and sometimes they come together, but there are lots more materials out there that I have not experimented with. But I guess I would if these started feeling like I was repeating myself a lot.
Hi, I have two questions. Firstly, what is the waggle dance?
What is welding?
What is the waggle dance you said for the
Oh, the
bee?
waggle dance.
And then the second question is, where do you get your inspiration for environmental themes in your work? Is it through your own life experiences? Is it requests from the client? Is it research that you purposefully go out and do? Is it something else? Where do you get your environmental inspiration?
I'm sure there's someone here that can explain the waggle dance better than I can. But the waggle dance is a way of honeybees communicate with each other. When one honeybee comes back to the hive after finding some nectar, they come back to the hive and they do this complicated figure-8 dance, and the axis on which it's happened, on which the dance takes place, points to the direction that he or she, I don't know who it is, found the nectar. And that angle is in relationship to the sun. And I have no idea. In relationship to where the sun was when they found it, where the sun is now to where they found it, I don't know that part. But I think just from reading the newspaper and being alive, there are plenty of environmental concerns that are impinging on one all the time. So there's no need to look for. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you think the reason why they asked you not to talk about your art is because they might axe the budget for art entirely for the Green Line extension?
No. There's several different artists, and they're planning some public presentation of the work that's in progress, and they haven't set a date for doing that, and they want to do it all at once. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to follow up on the question about inspiration for the environment, and your answer was a little different than your talk in the sense that there's lots of things to be concerned about, but your last section was celebrating the environment. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tension that you feel as an artist between your earlier one on sort of nuclear winter, how it was kind of a pointing towards the negative side, and now you're trying to celebrate through waggle dances and things like that. So could you talk about how you're sort of approaching environmental themes between being negative and positive?
Yeah, that's a great question. On one level, I think that when you're making your own work, you can indulge in your anxieties and your fears for your personal work. But when you're doing public work, the client has certain expectations, and in some of these pieces, very specific expectations. And and the public art commissioning company, like rightly so, wants something to be celebratory instead of anxiety producing.
I have one last question.
Yeah.
And I guess it goes after that one. I was thinking about, particularly for your private work, how do you think about the audience? Are you thinking about how will the public interact with the piece?
Yeah.
Or are you thinking about yourself, or what's the role of the audience in your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's ideally, I hope that I'm making pieces that engage the public in some sort of exploration process, whether it's finding your way around this off-cue architectural installation, or investigating, some of the perforated metal pieces or looking in these little scopes, that there's an element of surprise and exploration so that the public is engaged actively that way. And I think that using the material that's constantly changing as you're moving around, that's one reason why I like that material, because it's not as static as other pieces might be, or using both sides of a vessel to have some part of what I'm doing hidden and that you can have to discover and find a surprise is ideally what I hope.
I really like the vessels, by the way. All right, well, let's thank Nancy one more time.
Okay, thank you.